Hi there, and welcome to my review for Battle of the Sexes. So Battle of the Sexes is a film about Billie Jean King, who in the 1970s was the #1 female tennis player in the world. And it's about her fight to get women's tennis is respected as men's tennis. In fact, as the film points out, women's tennis would sell the same number of tickets as men's tennis, but women's tennis would be considered inferior. And so it's about her fight to get women's tennis to be respected equally, and about Bobby Riggs, an ex-male tennis player who challenged her to a exhibition match to prove that he could beat the #1 woman in the world and hence men are superior. So that's what the film is about. It's about a very important time in the feminist movement. It's about when women's rights and women's liberation really sort of gained a lot of traction. Billie Jean King, of course, is a very famous woman who many would call a feminist. So the film touches on important issues, or at least an important historical event. Part of why the film might be significant now is that perhaps some would argue there's relevance to today. Although personally I think the film is far too enamoured with historical legacy to really ever bring forth anything that makes the film seem like it's relevant to today. It just seems like, oh, here's what happened in the past. And I think it's actually to the film's shame that it doesn't really make it feel as current as it perhaps could. The story of Billie Jean King is fascinating, and obviously it's something that I think is worth telling, and I think the film tells it with admirable effort. It tells it perfectly fine. Every single aspect of the story is clearly told. You know why Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs did what they did to some extent. You understand what goes on. It's filmed to look like it was filmed in the 1970s, which I think is a nice look. I think visually it's quite good. Emma Stone plays Billie Jean King, and she is excellent. She is a real standout. She might be in contention for an Oscar nomination, although personally I doubt she would make it. There's so many very other just good aspects of the film. There's some humour which is quite good. It's, you know, it's quite light-hearted, although it tackles some deep-rooted issues. What's most interesting, I think, really is that the film also has a gay love story attached to the story, because Billie Jean King, as well as being a very respected tennis player and feminist, was also respected in later years by some in the LGBTQ community for her activism. I don't know personally about it, but the film ends with a card saying Billie Jean King was later an LGBTQ activist. And Billie Jean King herself was a lesbian. And so the film also has a lesbian story attached to it. In the first half of the film, that is far more interesting than the tennis, which is actually just kind of boring standard. She's a good tennis player and she has some issues. Billie Jean King's personal life is far more fascinating, and the Bobby Riggs stuff is kind of in the background. In the second half, it switches and the tennis becomes more interesting, because I think the love story kind of becomes lesser to the story, and I also think the love story just ends up being quite cheesy, and so as a result it doesn't really work, whereas the tennis side becomes more fascinating as the famous match, the Battle of the Sexes, approaches. Everyone could kind of guess how this ended, as it is a significant moment in history. I think the fact that you kind of know how it's going to end doesn't really affect the film, and I think the final match is still intense. The film, though, is very standard. It's very formulaic. Every single part of it is signposted. You know exactly where it's going, you know exactly how it's going to end. It doesn't do anything that's unpredictable. I suppose that if you didn't know about the lesbian aspect, maybe that's something you might find interesting, but I mean, Billie Jean King is famously someone from the gay community, so it wasn't something that I feel like most people would be unaware of. I think the film just tells its story very well, but doesn't do much more than that. It really just has a very nice sort of approach. I'd be tempted to say this is better than a lot of films, but the reality is it's so standard, you're going to forget it very soon. I barely feel like I have anything to say about it, because you'll watch it and it's nice, and it does do justice to the historical events that it depicts, but it certainly isn't a rabble-rousing cry for anything. It isn't really saying anything. It's just telling you a story where there's an obvious injustice. You know, obviously the way women are treated or were treated is abhorrent, and so you take that, and so the side is pretty obvious, and so the film just sort of tells you this story where the right side of history won, and that's what it does. The acting is good, the storytelling is okay. It's not exemplary, it's pretty standard, it's very forgettable. So, although I'm very tempted to say it's a very competent and perhaps even a good film, I think ultimately Battle of the Sexes is merely just okay. It's recommended, I think, if you have an interest in this stuff. I think there's much better feminist films out there. I think there's much better films dealing with historical events like this out there. But as an overall film, it's fine. If you like this review, give it a like. If you want to see more of my reviews, subscribe. If you want to keep up with my movie watching, you can follow me on Letterboxd or on Twitter. Links in the notes. And Battle of the Sexes is an okay film.